At the end of the pentagram rite, I saw like a doorway of red sparks before me. With the first set of vibrations, I smelt benzoin. With the second set, it was like there was orange boxes in the room. A bunch of them, not together, not on the ground. With the third set of vibrations, purple filled the cracks. With the fourth set, the presence ascended and descended a bit, and there was a sense of pressing in. With the fifth set, there was vertical purple, like curtains or ribbons that move through the shadows. With the sixth, seventh, and eighth sets of vibrations, it was as if there was an orange hand with 6 fingers outside of the door, and it was as big as the torso of a person. During the final reading, there was a tingliness that built up, and a strange, soothing sort of warmth. Some further phosphenes, and a sound, a low sound, not like any of the machines or animals that you hear in the background, maybe, that I'm trying to ignore as I share this, but a long sound, sort of non-threatening, just a ah, but not in that tone. During the final scrying, the shadows had this faint purple color, and something dark moved north through them. And I felt this strange tingling over my head and neck, a sort of warm feeling. 1805 reminds us to have a way beyond what we're told to be in this situation. At the Savoy Chapel reminds me of some things in an old yearbook, and sometimes we do hope that people don't ever change. The Poets under Pisces reminds us that one age paves the way for another age, and that things can be very colorful even in a stifled environment. June reminds us that the work that we do, or must do, is something that gets associated with the things at hand. Like the cherries and the soldiers. The Last Day of Leave, 1916, reminds us that we go forward to an unknown fate. To be called a bear nowadays might mean something different, right? But back in the day, it would just refer to the wildness of an individual, or their closer to natural state, and the closeness of family. A civil servant becomes a stuffed suit. Gulls and men reminds us that we find ourselves in an element where we are not the power, where it is proved where we are. The Alensford pursuit reminds us that witchcraft is connected to nature, but it's also connected to a twist of a pursuit. They may gather things the same way that the pre-Christians did, but there's a demonic involvement. American's charm is forming identifications with things. It kind of reminds me of what I did on some cave trips. And you think of metals and plants and all that sort of stuff. And I guess you need to practice with some stuff because some people are going to react to that with as humor. And it's like, no, dude, it's serious. I mean, you don't interrupt the ritual, you just continue, but you know. The sirens welcome Kronos. Again, nature is involved. But the talk about what would be unclean meat, not permissible to eat animals in the monotheist tradition, and drug use sets it apart from some traditions. Decatal do Chenab relates to the language of trees, doesn't it? Sort of an interpretive hand dance. But then again, I think this is intentional, much like some of those things that you see with some of these preachers, that you look up what they say and it's like, oh, that can't be just some random babbling. Their speaking in tongues was practiced. The Battle of the Trees is a fair list of tree symbolism. But when you go over those things, again, you're evoking related powers or categories in yourself. The Song of Bladewed relates to, flowers and shrubs and their mystical powers, as it's called. Symbolism and stuff might be a better way to put that, because in a way they don't have powers in themselves, but then in a way, like, there is effects that it may have on moods and other physical experience. Intercession in late October, well, a week into November is the real start of Samhain. And so, symbolically, that's like the end. So you want to postpone the end sometimes. The Tetragrammaton, herbs and stones upon the work. And then there's nothing to resist. Nuns and fish, reminds us of sublimation. The pull is still there, even though the desire is told no. The destroyer reminds us that the side that some people think they serve isn't the side they serve. Return of the goddess reminds us that nature communicates with us. In the Islamic world, there's the talk of the revealed book, there's the inspired book, and there's the book of nature. And by inspired book, I don't mean, the poet gets ideas that they work on and stuff like this. I mean, deity conveys a message, and that message is expressed not as explicitly as what is revealed. The white goddess refers to what is missing in mainstream ideas of religion. The chink reminds us of not the racial slur, but reminds us of the memorable details of events are the overall situation, like a sound. And nowadays they play a lot of music in the movies, so you remember the scenes by the different music. Counting the beats could be said to refer to music in a way, but it's more along the lines of the natural music. The jackals dressed Isis, of course, refers to Anubis and how, he had something to lose too. And he mourns the same. The death room reminds us that there are beings, and these beings wait for attention not to be paid. The young cordwainer reminds us of a journey towards plainness, a quiet to restore us and figure things out. Your private way is about gratitude of what you're not, and how we don't need to usurp or overly claim the position of others. My name and I reminds us that we are born into situations that we have to learn about, that there's something to figure out, how to work with it. Conversation piece reminds us that there's tools that can help us communicate when they're present, are indicators to bounce things off of. The ghost and the clock reminds us that sometimes it is just our imagination. Advice on May Day reminds us to use variety and make our expression beyond just lecturing. For the rain, it raineth every day. Well, it does somewhere, doesn't it? And it may not be best to complain about what's normal. And by normal, I mean inevitable, natural, not necessarily the things that become popular to the point where they're normal. Because some of that, no, no, no. Questions in a wood reminds us that sometimes we can think of the signs at hand about what a person's going to be. And how things are presented matters. The portrait reminds us to have some uniqueness in a relationship, something that relates to how you're unique to them and they are unique to you. Doreen reminds us that when we see ourselves as the one who gives forth the signs, sometimes it's others, and the connection of myth in their life that pulls us. The survivor reminds us to appreciate the things that those who did not survive the horrors missed. Prometheus connects to a sense of love, like the one who captivates you, holds you prey. Queen Mother to new queen should appreciate that the son has found a wife instead of a girlfriend or a prostitute. And it could have been that the sound I heard earlier was a psychological distortion of that owl. Succession of the drones is a slight bit unexpected. And perhaps it relates to the army. All these people in close quarters, some homophobia going around. Damocles reminds us that the childish things have to end. Homage to Texas is sort of a good sort of prejudice. A lot of places were better than they are back in the day. And looks and character certainly need to be combined. The dilemma is about being occupied. And nowadays we have, TV and all that stuff. So people will occupy themselves with whatever's on the TV, even if it's not redeeming in what it's talking about, not developmental. General Bloodstock's Lament for England reminds us that overdoing it with formalities can kind of ruin things. Welcome to the Caves of Arta reminds us to go beyond the description of others. To a poet in trouble reminds us, much like the end of Surah 26 in Al-Quran, that art needs to be expressed in reality. To Calliope reminds us to be direct. The straw reminds us that there's very often things unaddressed. The foreboding, in some sense, addresses some sort of procrastination. But it does remind us that we need to let go sometimes. Cry, fa, reminds us that the same principles with one set of morals and ethics may be seen a different way with another. Hercules at Nemea reminds us that there's a difference between being brave and being proud. Now, one of the things that I experienced during the initial 8 sets of vibrations was my breath seemed to give off an orange light. Now it's just your normal touch of white. And this built up starting in the second set. Dialogue on the headland is an expression of lost souls comforting each other. There's another poem here that's kind of that category. Lovers in Winter reminds us that we should think or try for the long run. Esau and Judith reminds us, well, first of all, Judith as some sort of, putting it further back in history, idea of the Jews could be why that is there, but it reminds us, particularly in marriage, but other relationships too, that we need to go beyond the fantasy to fulfill our promises. The mark is sort of the thought that people get into, and really certain extremes don't unblot things. They increase the blot. With the gift of a ring reminds us of the difference between marriage and intended short-term relationships. Are out of context relationships like that. Leodon and Kurathitter reminds us that people retreat into principles and their feelings may not quite agree. But let's remember that our control and our reward systems, mesocortical and mesolimbic, do tend to need work. The seahorse doesn't seem to relate much to the actual seahorse, although it does seem to employ a touch of its form in the reference. But like a child, our feelings, our emotions can make us feel like stuff is ours, are owed to us, are we owe. and it cost us. The devil at Barry Pomeroy reminds us that through how people obey or how people attribute things, the devil gets some control by consent. Reproach to Julia reminds us that we need to be careful how we hold back. We need to be careful how we may try to negotiate for more and lose all that we could have had. Dethronement is about being replaced relationship-wise. Cat goddesses reminds us that our ethics are not the ethics of others, particularly when we refer to animals that aren't human. The blue fly reminds us that there are lessons as profound as scripture in nature. Rhea reminds us to dismiss the unintended from the innocent. The hero is what it is. It accomplishes what it does. Spiritually, without having to be mentioned by others. Marginal warning reminds us to be careful in pursuing guilt. The encounter reminds us that we shouldn't always stir things up. I'm through with you forever reminds me one time when emotionally somebody said something about like that, and that they hated me, and then very quickly, and you know, I didn't want to hear it, so I said, okay, bye. And then they phoned back, and it's like, I could never hate you, such and such, I just, and it wasn't forever. But we shouldn't cut ourselves off like that. There are people that will use irrevocable divorce in that way, and it's like, oh, don't do that. Just, one divorce is actually a divorce. If you decide to take it back later, that's okay, but don't finalize things right away as in something that can't be taken back. With her lips only reminds us that no matter how moving the words, sometimes the words haven't been followed up with internally. The blotted copybook reminds us that people will sign yearbooks and such things in certain ways. And I've pointed out how, like, for example, in this one book that was autographed, some of the things said in it was like, and I understood later that some people who signed my one yearbook in a certain way was they were just trying to be, I don't know, punk rock or something. And they weren't really my enemies or something. But, I was like, why did you vandalized my yearbook? If you weren't going to sign it normal or appropriately, The sacred mission reminds us that sometimes we must try even though it's going to cost us. It's going to make us hurt in different ways. And perhaps these things are done because there's already that pain. From the embassy, remind us that sometimes we do need to do things according to a different culture. But we can hope to hold on to some amenities from our own. Sirico at Dea reminds us that some understandings are not for us. Penthesilea reminds us that when people do things for us, it's important to offer our thanks. Poet's Corner reminds us that when we are showy or passionate, then there's consequences that come back at us. Coronation Address reminds us that service is better than praise. Beauty in Trouble reminds us that marriage is better when it's about character and doing what's right on your part. A Lost Jewel is about not quite attaining what you want, but you know of its details. The windowsill seems to be of an aging woman with her lover or husband or whatever. Some people figure that when their beauty starts to fade, that, they won't be loved anymore. And it's like, that's, well, love of the body, perhaps. But, that just fades a little. Spoils reminds us that hiding away your keepsakes may not be the way that they are the best for you. I mean, maybe you keep that a secret to yourself, but you know what I mean. You don't just lock it away and leave it alone. The clearing reminds of where one goes to meet, or where events took place. And if you remember the details of that place, then you remember more about the event. The Three Pebbles reminds us of some intentional grave goods found. And it begs the question, what might it mean? Possibly implies that perhaps someone is upset about a lack of sureness, but it's honest to say it could be. End of the world is sort of like a lot of people are right now. And it may not be what you want. There may be something with that end that's not what you want. If you just are part of, particularly if you're part of the world destroying itself. To a pebble in my shoe. Well, if you do find one, it helps to look, but somehow I ended up with an interesting pebble some time ago. I think earlier in this year, somehow a rock ended up in my shoe, and it seemed like a polished stone, like it was intentionally polished. Sometimes you think that something is worth polishing that you find. The tenants reminds me of how some people say that it's not places that are haunted, it's people that are haunted. And in a way, that's true. But then certain things get left behind. Whether a person leaves alive or dead, certain things get left behind in certain places. And certain things don't bother new people that come to some places because they have the lifestyle or way that closes off that openness of what was in that place. Like, I've gone to places and recited some things. People may remember the Burnt Bridge Creek Park incident that I related, that me and someone went there and we encountered a temple of Baal. My moral forces reminds us that there's things to hate about people from all sorts of walks of life, but one of the things that we do about that is we, you know, act according to the situation. There's no need to chase away everyone. You just, you know, react favorably to what is right to be favorable towards. Interview reminds us that we can add our own thing or we can respond in our own way. Reminds us that we have to answer to the collection of our own works, the face in the mirror. Reminds us that our choices of appearance are not just for us. Forbidden words reminds us that there's secondary associations with things, and we got to be careful with that. Song for New Year's Eve reminds me of the differences that some cultures use in referring to the same thing. Some will focus on how something is dealt with. Others will focus on what is being dealt with. But we can welcome the opportunities. Alexander and Queen Jeanette reminds me of how so many shows have used the term 13. And I wonder if it refers to that being an age where it used to be most common for females to start hitting puberty. The odd person out with a group of 12, various other associations, but particularly when it's referring to a woman, you have this 13, right? House, Dexter, and there's a bunch of others that a person can bring up. The choral pool reminds us to figure out the other players in the game, the other things in the game of life. Gratitude for a nightmare reminds us that even though we may get the comforts along the way, there is something to be said for having a shock that leads us to realization without really harming us. Friday night, the Sabbath, reminds us that rather than criticizing ourselves over some lack of being perfect, we could be perfecting something. Or, well, that's not so explicit, but that's just what it gets me thinking. We could be focused on the relationship features of the breaks that we take. The naked and the nude is one of those, it depends on one's approach to things. Now, some things are not about being bold, it's about being stupid, and it's not going to go anywhere good for you, and it's just putting you in danger or whatever. This thing where people get naked as a protest or get naked to kind of cause aversion in a fight, and if you lose the fight, it could be much, much worse. Or if you think that getting naked is a protest, I mean, come on. You're just violating the rights of others by your... Woman and the Tree reminds me of, was it the Silver Lake? Where was it? Somewhere in Washington. We came across this rocky cliff, and someone had vandalized it, mentioning the different women that he had been there with before. In a way, it's not just the man that needs to prove himself. Sometimes the woman needs to prove herself too. And a man should be honest to his word. Destruction of evidence reminds us that different sorts of creatures have some of the same habits. And there's like a shock to some people that, oh, you're not even a predator, and you've done this, and well, sometimes such and such isn't the amoral or immoral thing that people think it is. And I've just said something that's bound to be thought of in all sorts of ways if repeated out of context. The poem refers to a horse and a wolf. So wolves are predators and horses are vegetarians. So, well, hamsters are too, right? The second Fated reminds us that a lot of things will be started and not quite finished. And there are different stages in life, and, well, how's that going to go along further? A slice of wedding cake reminds us that such things are not always the easiest of choices. A plea to boys and girls reminds us that people connect to things in one sense, but they don't have the whole picture. A bouquet from a fellow roseman reminds us of those who reject gifts, but it makes clear of competition and how you could acknowledge the accomplishment of others. Yes, reminds us to be more direct and clear with our language. Yes, people understand some things like yeah, but there's a different feeling to a yes. The outsider reminds me of something that you find when you study the Bible. You find out that there was additions and subtractions, and some of these changes became permanent. And likewise, even if you leave the scripture as is, some of the commentary becomes as if it's official doctrine for some groups of people. But some of that needs to be distinguished from the core path itself. The enlisted man reminds us that once some decisions are made, in a way they can't be taken back. Now, morally and ethically, you could refuse to take part in some things, but if you do that, then society may still hold you to it in a way. Mike and Mandy is, about a couple that competes with meanness towards each other, but at this point it's just about words. But the words that are said could turn into a lot worse than words. Nothing. Well, people say nothing, but it's always something. Call it a good marriage, just like in the Bhagavatam, referring to the mischievous actions of a child. Well, good child to the mother who never witnesses it. Read me, please reminds us of sometimes we find things along our way and we get curious about them. The twin of sleep reminds us that death is slow. Around the mountain reminds us that we don't have to make things up because reality is ready to express itself to us.